Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today. My name is Andrew Barron. I'm with the School of Natural Sciences at Macquarie University. And I was asked to talk to you a bit about the varroa mite. Um, but what I want to do, because I think you might hear a lot about varroa mites in this conference, I wanted to put it into a broader context of the mite, stress on honeybee colonies, and what we're now understanding about how colonies react to stress and how we might be able to buffer some of those stress responses. So it's a difficult, stressful moment to be talking about varroa mites. We've got the incursion that came in through Newcastle, and right at the time that I'm recording this, which is early September, we've now gone more than a week with no new detections of infected colonies. So we're at that. I don't know. There's that really stressful, cautious optimism that maybe we've actually got on top of this and maybe we've got it under control. And I really want to lean into that optimism, but I think we're going to have an anxious wait before it might be possible that we might be able to say this is under control and we've got this thing eradicated. And I really, really hope we can say that, but it's all going to depend on what we see in the next swarming season. So let's hope we keep hitting these days of um, no new detections, and let's hope that everything I'm saying about the varroa mite and stress on bees remains of academic interest only, and we can go back to being the only major island in the world that is still free of varroa mite. Let's just, yeah, let's hope we get there. I want to kind of put things in a context because when I talk about bees, when I do research on bees, people ask how are bees in Australia doing relative to the rest of the world, and I think this slide really shows how we're doing relative to the rest of the world. These are data from the Be Aware program in the United States. Now, Be Aware has been gathering, it's a volunteer-based reporting of beekeepers' colony losses across as much of the United States for which they can get data. And they started this program back in 2008, and it's been running annually ever since. Now, we could critique these data because it's voluntary reporting, so maybe there's a bias in who's sending data in. But even so, we've got enough of this data now that we can see some clear trends. And what is scary in these trends is we are reliably seeing more than 40% of colonies dying each year in the US. Now, of course, that's much higher than we're experiencing in Australia, and that's pretty damn horrific. What's nice about this is that the data are broken down to an overwinter survey and losses in the summer, and then they're also reporting the total annual losses. So you can see those in the different colored bars on this graph here. They only started recording the summer data in 2011. And I think what's also alarming is the summer data in some years is even higher than the losses over winter. So we have high losses year round in the US. This is not a good situation to be in. This breaks the data down by what they call backyard beekeepers, sideliner beekeepers, and commercial beekeepers. I think all these category names are a little bit rude. Um, I think we kind of get what they mean, but not every hobbyist beekeeper has a backyard. I don't even know what a sideliner is, but anyway. Ignoring that, there's some interesting trends that are here. In that, what we could see, for example, is we might like to think that in the hobbyists, they might have more time to spend with their colonies and they might have lower death rates. But no, the death rates in the hobbyist beekeepers are higher than in the commercial operators. Now, perhaps if we were to come up with a reason for that, maybe we'd reach to there's greater expertise with the commercial beekeepers. Perhaps we'd need some data on that really. But this bucks that sort of folk idea that maybe we've got better cared for bees in the hobbyists. One thing that is interesting, though, is when we look at the commercial beekeepers, the deaths over summer are higher than the deaths for the sideliners or backyard beekeepers. That might be, again, we need data. This is pure speculation. I'm good at speculating. That might be that the commercial beekeepers are having to work the colonies harder over the summer period, either for pollination service or for honey production. Possibly there's something there. But the main point I want to make here is that we have far higher death rates being reported in the US than we're experiencing in Australia currently. And if you wanted me to point a finger at what the difference is there, the difference is the varroa mite. We've got this additional massive pathogenic load that is being carried in the United States that we're not currently, please let it stay that way, we're not currently having to deal with in Australia. Now, one of the things my lab has been looking at a lot is colony performance, forage longevity, and the performance of individual forager bees. And the tool we use for this are these very, very beautiful RFID tags. Now, that stands for radio frequency identification tags, which we glue to the back of the bee. It weighs almost nothing. And when this tag goes through the sensors that we put at the entrance to the hive, it gives a digital readout of the individual identity of that bee every time she leaves the hive or comes back in. So we can then transform that into a pattern of lifetime activity. So here we have the lifetime activity of 3 bees. Each column is 1 bee, each row is 1 day, and each bar is each time the bee transitioned from inside the hive to outside the hive. And you can see the richness of the data that we get. You can see the phases of the bee's adult life, from working inside the hive and only sort of sticking their head out the entrance once a day, to then this very, very active period of foraging that they maintain until they die. And we've got pretty fancy and coupled that RFID to scales and cameras so that for each individual bee, we can get not just when they've gone in and out, but we can also get how much nectar or pollen they've gathered in their foraging trip, and we can photograph them to see what sort of pollen they've got. And what we get is some really quite nice detailed data for individual bees. In this figure, each row is an individual bee. And what we've got are the foraging trips made by different bees across a period, moving from April into May, the number of foraging trips each day, and the percentage of those foraging trips that brought back pollen. What we saw when we looked at a lot of this data was that if we looked at the number of foraging trips performed by age, the age at which the bee was last seen, it's the middle-aged bees who are the most productive. This is my great shout out to late middle age. It's the middle-aged bees that are the most productive. Thank you. And we've been looking at why this is the case. And we've now got a lot of data of this kind of family, tracking bees across their lifetimes, relating that to number of foraging trips and how productive they are. What we've seen reliably, and this graph is actually, it's a pretty horrible graph, really. It's massively overcomplicated for the very simple point I'm trying to make. There's an optimal age at which a bee needs to start to forage for the bee to be most productive. And that age is about 2 weeks old. So if our bee forages and starts to forage before she's 2 weeks old as an adult, then she doesn't perform very well. If she starts to forage when she's too old as an adult, she doesn't perform very well. We've got this optimal window for bees about 2 weeks old as an adult. That's if they start to forage at that age, that's when they're most productive as a forager. So to understand that, we put it into the context of the bee's working life in the hive. We know that bees spend the first, well, if they're laid as an egg, they spend the first 3 weeks of life in the hive developing as a larva, they pupate, they emerge as an adult bee. And then the first role of the adult bees is to stay within the hive and to raise the next generation of the larvae. So they'll spend about 2 weeks, hopefully, inside the hive, raising the next generation of larvae. Then they transition to foraging, and then they stay as a forager until they ultimately die. Now, this is considered an adaptive thing to do, because foraging is by far the most risky job that the bee has to do. And so if they delay their foraging until the later part of their life, they've at least made a contribution to the colony by raising the next generation. And then hopefully they'll then also have a successful foraging career before they finally cark it. What we've noticed though, and this came from our work on pesticides, but also work that goes way back early into my career, is that if we stress the bees, we accelerate that pattern. We push them into a foraging phase earlier than they might otherwise be. So the work I've done at Macquarie University on the sublethal effects of pesticides showed this very clearly. We treated the bees with literally almost an undetectable amount of the pesticide imidacloprid, 5 parts per billion, right at the threshold we could detect the chemical. And they gave this minute dose of pesticides to the bees. We found that the bees that have been treated with imidacloprid, which is this column here, they started to forage 1.3 days earlier than normal. So the point at which they began to forage was moved earlier in their life. Now, 1.3 days doesn't sound very much, but a related consequence of that was that the bees that have been treated with imidacloprid, they produce about a third fewer foraging trips in their lifetime. So here we've got the foraging flights, also the orientation flights here. Let's focus on the foraging flights. Here are our imidacloprid treated bees. Each dot is one bee, and this is the mean, the bar here and here. And you can see an enormous reduction in the lifetime foraging trips of a bee. So stress them with imidacloprid, they start to forage a little bit earlier, but we see a massive reduction in foraging flights. Now, this is another way of showing these data. Again, it's a complicated graph, but it shows these relationships quite nicely. Here we've got a control colony and a pesticide-treated colony. Here we've got the age at which bees started to forage from 0 to 23 days. And then color-coded in each bar is the lifetime number of trips that each bee made. What you can see in every case, the bees that start to forage when they're very young perform very few trips in their foraging life. We really want bees that are ideally in the yellows and red shades. That's what we want for our forager bees. We're most likely to see most of those bees in the bees that start to forage at about the 2-week-old point here or later. You see fewer of them in the very young bees. But if we stress the colony with imidacloprid, all the bees perform less well. More bees start to forage when they're very young, and the bees that forage when they're very young are less likely to be a successful forager. So if we stress the bee with imidacloprid, the bees start to forage when they're younger, they perform fewer orientation flights, and the lifetime foraging performance is reduced by about 30%. Now, it's not just pesticides that do this. Any stressor of the bee has this response. If a bee is stressed, the bee responds to the stress by starting to forage. That's the pattern that we now understand. So if we apply a starvation stress, we see the same thing. If we apply a heat shock stress, we see the same thing. If we apply a disease stress to the colony, we see the same thing. Even a migration stress, moving the colony, we see the same response. Stressed bees respond to stress by starting to forage when they're younger. Now, that is really, it's adaptive. If we think about it as a human, as a human organism, if we're stressed, our response is to try to accumulate resources so that we can actually give our body a capacity to recover from that stress. I think here we're seeing the same thing at the level of the hive. If the hive is stressed, the hive is reacting by bees going out to forage to bring the resources back to the hive so the hive can stock up on resources in the hope that it can get through that stress. But there's an unintended consequence of this that can potentially be quite destructive. And that's that if our young bees, if our stressed bees start to forage, and they start to forage when they're younger, and those younger bees are less good at foraging, the risk is that if the stress is maintained for too long, you compound the impact on the colony because you're sending out your young bees to forage, but they're less good at foraging and less productive, more likely to die. And the consequence of that could be a compounded stress on the colony. So we actually turned to some computational modeling to explore that. So we modeled how stress might impact a colony. And this is our kind of toy model of how a colony works. So we imagine that for any individual bee, this is how we modeled the bee moved through compartments in its life. It started off as a larva, it became a pupa, a capped brood, that emerged as what we called a hive bee, a bee that worked in the hive to raise the next generation. That then became a forager bee, and it was forager bees that died. Now, and this point at which the bee transitioned to foraging, this is essentially controlled by the stress on the colony. So if there's a strong existing foraging force, this will inhibit the younger bees from becoming foragers. We also modeled that the size of your hive bee population influences how many larvae can be raised by the hive. And we also modeled the dynamics of food in the hive. So we had food external to the hive. Food could be collected by the foragers, but the foragers also ate food. The hive bees ate food. The brood ate food. And if there was an interruption of food flowing into the colony, the stress response of the colony would be to actually cannibalize the larvae. And then any excess food, of course, a beekeeper would harvest as honey. So what we really want is a colony to build an excess of food. So that's our kind of model. This is how a colony works. And then the question we asked is, we're going to impose a stress in this colony by increasing the death rate of our foragers. Now that could be a consequence of varroa mite, for example, weakening the foragers, making them more likely to die outside the hive. It could also be a consequence of a pesticide. It could be a consequence of a nutritional stressor. But all we did then was we incremented up the death rate on the foragers. And then we asked, in this simulation of a colony, what happens to the colony if we do that? We just increase the death rate of the foragers. It was actually quite dramatic what happened. Like everything happened. We had, as a result of the foragers dying earlier, the foraging population fell. So our hive bees became foragers. That decreased the population of the hive bees. The hive bees weren't as successful as foragers, so we started to see hive bees dying in the transition to foraging. Because our hive bee population fell, then we started to see reduced capacity to raise the next generation of brood. As our forager population was now populated by younger bees, it was less effective. So we got a decrease in the rate of food being returned to the colony because the foragers were now less efficient. We saw a decline in food in the colony. And as we saw a decline in food in the colony, if we pushed this to the extreme, the amount of food in the colony was no longer sufficient to support the developing brood. And so then we really started to see a decline in the larval population. So just changing this one parameter, the death rate on the forager, which is the kind of thing a varroa infection would do, or any chronic disease infection, or any chronic pesticide exposure, we had this knock-on effect to all of these elements of how a healthy colony would actually work. What was most telling was how these changes manifested over time. This again is quite a complicated graph, so we'll work with panel A here. And in panel A, this is our healthy condition. So here we had only 10% of our forager bees dying each day. That's actually probably what we'd expect for a normal healthy colony. So the average age of our forager bees, they would on average, a bee would have 10 days of forager life. That's pretty good. And here we've got the amount of food in the colony, we've got the number of foragers, we've got the age at which bees become foragers in the red line, we've got the brood population there, and we've got the hive. No, we haven't. So that's the hive bee population, and that's our forager bee population. So even though this is a model, we got a situation in the hive that looks very, very normal and very healthy to a beekeeper. We've got the hive accumulating an excess of food. We've got more hive bees than we've got forager bees. We've got a larval population, and the colony has grown to a healthy, steady adult size, and then it's reached a stable population. It's reached a mature adult size, but it's continuing to increase in excess of food, which a beekeeper, of course, would harvest as honey. If we ratcheted up that death rate, and when we increase that now to 20%, so now our average forager is only getting 5 days as a productive foraging life. What we saw was interesting. We had the colony hit a stable state still. The whole colony shrank in size, became much smaller. It was still accumulating excess food, but at a much, much, much slower rate. And our colony is now sitting at a stable population, but a much smaller population. So a beekeeper might look at this and think, well, the colony is actually, it's doing okay. You know, it's raising brood. It's got a brood population in there. It's just a little bit small, and there's not much honey for me to take off. But what that's hiding that this colony is under twice as much stress as a healthy condition. We ratchet that now to 40% of death rate on the forager bees. So now our average forager bee is only getting 2.5 days of a productive foraging life. Under these conditions, we don't really accumulate excess food. We're holding a stable population, but the colony is tiny and not growing, and the ratios are starting to change. You can see we've now actually got fewer hive bees than we've got larvae in the colony. I'm looking at panel C here. So the colony is now starting to look really odd, imbalanced, but it's managing to hang on. And that's the point I want to make. This is under 4 times the stress of a healthy colony. But the internal mechanisms to buffer stress are so good in a beehive, it's holding on, but it's only just holding on. It's just bringing back enough food to sustain itself. But notice it's still producing larvae. It's putting everything it's got into raising that next generation of larvae. But then if we move the colony literally over a tipping point, so we move now from 40% death rate to 42% death rate, we got a completely different dynamic. The colony, it's like the colony fell off a cliff. At this level of stress, the stress overwhelmed the colony. It couldn't bring in food. The food levels, even the food reserves in the hive, crashed, and everything went pear-shaped down to the point at which we had 0 bees, 0 forager bees, and could not model the situation beyond that point. So we had a tipping point, and this speaks to how colonies buffer stress. They have a phenomenal capacity to buffer stress. The consequence of that is a beehive can be under quite profound stress, but looks like it's kind of doing okay. You know, it's got foragers, it's got larvae, it's small, it's got a bit of food, but it's actually under monumental stress and it's just holding on. But if that stress goes over a threshold, the whole colony, the whole dynamic turns on itself and the population crashes and collapses really quite quickly. So it tells the story of how good colonies are at buffering stress. It means that we can't always see when a colony is under extreme stress. And it talks of the importance of reducing the load of stress on a colony. So if we want to make things better, how can we make things better? And I think the way to look at this question is what we need to do is reduce the total stress load on a colony. And I like to think of stresses of a beehive in 4 major categories. The diseases, especially the varroa mite, pesticides, land management, which interrupts nutrition, and climate change, which of course messes up springs, introduces droughts and floods and things that really, really mess up the bees. So what can we do to make things better? Beekeepers are really, really good at detecting diseases in their hives. Of course, the earlier you can detect and treat, the better to bring down the pathogen load on the colony. And this is my biggest concern for Varroa. If we get Varroa established in Australia, we have yet another pathogen load that we have to measure. Pesticides, reduce the exposure to the bees wherever possible. Land management, not something beekeepers can fix, but what beekeepers are really good at is using very nice areas of bushland with very rich floral resources. And I think hopefully we could potentially encourage farmers to put more refuges for bees into their environments that could give more stable foraging for the bees, so adjusting the land use practice models. Climate change, a hard one to fix. Really, we're going to have a different conversation about the economic model and what we value in our environments. So to summarize, really the story about the varroa mites in the context of stress on a colony, and our job has to be to reduce the total stress burden that our hives are carrying. If we can take that stress burden down, the hives are more likely to prosper. The response of bees to stress, all stressors that I've studied, is that adult bees begin to forage precociously. The consequence of that is more bees are out foraging, but each forager is performing less well. And that compromised forager force will compound the stress on the colony. And ultimately, improving bee health is about reducing that total burden of stress on the colony. And I'll stop there and thank you for your time.